One of the other challenges is also in making sure that the system is balanced, and this is done by droop shifting. The hydro and the diesel units operate on frequency droop curves. I don't want to go into the details too much, but it's the way that the whole system shares the power out between the generating units, dependent on the frequency of the system. And in our model, the controller performs what we call explicit droop shifting. In other words, it will shift the droop curves by a definite amount according to the levels that were determined in the unit commitment. So if a particular generator was required to generate a particular amount, then we shifted the droop curve so that it would do that. We also put in a dump load into the simulation, not because we want to dump energy necessarily, but it is a very useful tool in the model so that we can more easily quantify excess energy when the wind penetration is increased. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So if we put all that together, the simulation process is such that we have our inputs on the left, we have the load on the system, we have the reservoir start levels, we have the reservoir inflows, and we have the wind. We put this all into the simulation, the model components, which are the generators, the turbines, reservoir characteristics, and such. And then we have this overall operational strategy of which generators are to come on when and with which others. And this gets translated into this supervisory control. And the whole thing goes through into the IPSIS solvers. And this then does the iterative calculations for each time step so that there is an energy balance at each of the time steps throughout the simulation period, which for us was about 6 months. So it calculates each minute in each of those for the whole of the 6 months. And hopefully we get an output. And of course what you're all asking is, what does that output look like? So this is a sample output from September 2006. The top one is actually just the load on the system. And then you can see each of the traces. This is the simulation output from each of the generators in the system. There are many more down the bottom here. They wouldn't fit on the page, but just to give you the idea. And from this, you can tell when the simulation reckons which generators are on and what they should be producing. So it's power down the left-hand axis, time along the bottom, and along the right here in green, this is the level of the reservoirs that the simulation is predicting. So that's the sort of output that we can get. And of course, if you integrate these, if you sum them up, these power graphs, then of course you can get the energy production. And it's the energy production figures that are quite interesting to compare between the simulation and the measured. This is from August 2006, a fairly dry month. Down on the left-hand side here, we have the different production sums. This column is what was measured in the system. These are the simulation results, and this is the deviation between the two. And as you can see, we're quite happy that the deviations are fairly small. But of course, the test of anything like this is how it operates under a different condition. And if we take a wetter month, which was November 2006, and you can see that the hydro loading was much higher then. We also see that the deviations are not too bad. So we feel reasonably happy that we have got a handle on the system and a reasonable representation of how the system is operated. So what are the outcomes? Well, this is the outcome that everybody talks about, of course. With the present system, our simulations reckon that we can have about 3 times the present amount of wind in there. And that's to say around about an additional 8 megawatts, which kind of corresponds quite nicely with what Siv has just presented. The interesting question is, of course, though, why not more? Well, I said earlier that this increased dump load activity that we see in the simulations is a feature of when you put more than this amount of wind in, we get more dump load activity. And for us, this indicates that we're reaching some kind of limit in the system. And it's interesting to see that we actually want to displace diesel production, really, rather than hydro. That should be one of the overall aims. But what we actually find is when we put in more wind, we actually end up displacing hydro and dumping energy, which is not really that useful. So what's happening? The limitation that we found is that the ability to displace diesel production is restricted by the high minimum load limits on some of the diesels. Some of the diesel generating units have to run at maybe at least 50% loading. And when you try and mix that with wind power coming in, you find that is quite a severe restriction, and that you actually end up trying to put more load on the system to keep the diesels running above their minimum load. And that extra load is the dump load that we found.
3 minutter.
Thank you. So we found other limitations from investigating the system behavior over this 6-month period. And through investigating the various other scenarios, we looked at additional hydro turbines, additional inflow, diesel generators with lower minimum loads, and a mixture of all of those three. And the conclusions are that with the present system, there are these limitations for accepting wind power. The first one is what we've talked about, the minimum load limits of the diesels. It means that we can't really replace too much of the diesel generation without either dumping energy or curtailing the production from wind energy. The hydro turbines don't have this minimum load limit to the same extent, and so therefore, in theory, they can help integrate more wind into the grid than the diesels, but they have a limitation in that there are relatively small sizes of reservoirs. And this means that, as everybody I'm sure can understand, there's a relatively limited energy store, but it also means the availability of the hydro turbines is not so high, and so they can't be as useful for reserve. And this means that the diesels are preferentially used, and we don't end up with the fuel savings that we thought we were going to have. So, what are the implications, or what might be the implications for pumped storage here? Well, of course, with the usual caveat that further studies are needed, pumped storage may well help to relieve some of these system limitations that we found. We can use the pumped storage to pump instead of curtailing the wind power. As one of my colleagues says, pump, not dump. That is a relief of the first limitation. It may effectively help to increase the hydro store available, so to increase the amount of water available for the hydro turbines, which is a relief of the first of the hydro limitations. And it may also help to increase the availability of the hydro turbines for use as a reserve, which allows diesels to be turned off rather than just regulated down. And this is where you really save. If you can actually turn a diesel off, you will save a lot more in fuel than just by down regulating it. And that's because of the minimum fuel consumption that a diesel engine has. And this helps to relieve the second limitation of the hydro turbines. So we think there is good potential for investigating pumped storage, not just for its ability to store energy, but also in its ability to to allow or facilitate more wind into the system. And I think that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.